Hello, welcome to part 2 of the Human Prospect lecture. Now, as the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution advanced, by the 19th and 20th centuries, this is increasingly framed in terms of political movements which frame the human prospect. So there is a spectrum from democracy on the one hand, offering its solution for how society should be organised, to totalitarianism on the other. In this spectrum, we have, on the far right, we have fascism. We also have on the far left, Marxism or communism, and a lot of similarity between them. And we have democracies, social democracy, liberal democracies, various forms of each system, fascism, communism and democracy, are proposed in the 19th and 20th century as solutions to the human predicament, supposedly offering a better future. We examined some key figures: Marx, for example, Keynes, Peterium Sorokin, who was a Russian sociologist, Carl Jung, Lovelock, James Lovelock, Ecological Crisis, and Heilbronner, who wrote a famous book in the 70s on the human prospect. We also contemplate the extinction of the human species, or at the very least, species trauma, which simply means that instead of the human species inflicting trauma on most of the other species on this planet, that the human species undergoes its trauma inflicted upon itself, in which case it might escape extinction but have serious damage to its species. There are many consciousness changes which are mentioned, typical of the 19th and 20th centuries, from political consciousness changes on the one hand to individual rights on the other. But does this change the human prospect at all? Severe changes to climate at the end of this lecture are highlighted. I hope you enjoy the second part of the Human Prospect lecture. Other visions for the human prospect in the 19th and 20th century that developed were socialism and social democracy. Socialism stops short of the communism, but it offers substantial reform of the system, state interference, nationalisations and distributional arrangements which can be aggressive, or in some cases simply reformist. Social democracy, the more reformist aspects of socialism, is attempts to create a consensus, and a progressive consensus. I would say the European Union is a social democratic vision, which attempts to get fair distributional arrangements around Europe, and be willing to dig into its pocket. For example, Germany is willing to dig into its pocket to help other countries, or to help refugees. It took in 1 million refugees recently, didn't it? So these were extraordinary arrangements by social democratic countries with social democratic vision. So, but they can be aggressive or reformist depending on how much they lean towards state control and harsh direct systems, or more reformist systems like I would suggest the European Union is. The opposites in the 20th century clashing for big visions for the human prospect. Democracy has certainly prevailed in general, although it had its moments of decline in the 1920s and 30s, at the time of Keynes was writing his General Theory of Employment, trying to rescue the system out of the Depression. Democracy has been threatened by, in its own view, by communism, and in various parts of the world, or by Islam. But generally speaking, democracies in the West have survived. Whether they'll survive the times to come, I'm not sure. And I'll give you my reasons for that in a moment. Versus totalitarianism, the totalitarian systems, of course, have had their central incentive that has gone out to people that the human prospect can be bettered, substantially bettered. I mentioned my father, who read Marx and communism, and a believer in communism since he was a young man. This was because of the injustices in Ireland, the role of the Catholic Church, the role of Britain in Ireland and the colonial situation, the bourgeoisie in Ireland, as he called them, who had just provided no leadership. And from this, he came across the theories of communism and Karl Marx as some kind of saving grace with the new human prospect. Little did he know that in the 1950s, as he was formulating his vision, like millions of other people were, and supporting the communist revolutions and Stalinism and so on, Maoism, that these systems were proving to be awful totalitarian systems, totally the opposite of advancing the human prospect. So much so that these systems of China and Russia abandoned their central communist systems for something rather different and rather closer to the, not exactly the democratic visions of the West, but the capitalist visions of the West. They wanted the capitalism and the benefits of it without the democracy. Because democracy, and probably quite rightly, democracy probably doesn't fit various countries very well, who have totally different traditions. I'm not a person who believes that democracy should be spread willy-nilly around the globe. I think people with different traditions will have different political systems, and you have to accept that, and that's the way it should be. Young, by the mid-1950s, mid-century, 20th century, in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, of course, was talking in terms which we recognise from the previous lecture, that the condition of humanity under the totalitarianism of his time, the Nazis, the Second World War, and the growth of capitalism and materialism, a general materialist culture, that modern man had lost his soul. And his whole endeavour was to try and find the way back into the soul. First of all, he found it in psychotherapy, didn't he? The self, the soul, you might call it, as some autonomous, almost independent unit that you could see in people's dreams and unconscious, which gave them guidance and gave them the way forward, or gave them even moral guidance sometimes, but not in the ordinary sense of morals, but in some kind of inner sense of inner meaning, which was embodied inside human beings. The modern man in search for a soul, his whole endeavour was to try and provide a means for the discovery or the rediscovery of the soul. By the end of his life, however, he was contemplating the end of humanity, and said that it is perfectly possible. He says, "We do not know how far the process of coming to consciousness can extend, or where it will lead. Neither can we know the prospects for the species Homo sapiens. Will it imitate the fate of other species which once flourished on Earth and are now extinct? Biology can advance no reasons why this should not be the case." That was Young in mid last century, contemplating the potential end of humanity, as many people have done. He wasn't unique in a prophet in this. This has just gained force, hasn't it, over the 20th century and into our own times. This has particularly gained force as, strange enough, as we've abandoned religions in the West and embraced more and more science and learned more about ourselves as a species. The more we've learnt ourselves as a species, the more we've realised that we're not a noble savage, we were very destructive from the very beginning, that the human impact upon the planet way before capitalism was very substantial and destructive, that human beings, besides being creative and so on, have this extreme negative impact upon their environment. This is now well documented and well known, and Harari summarises this in his book Sapiens. But you can read more about it in lots of websites. The biologydiversity website.com, biologydiversity.com, explains this in greater detail, and the evidence for this. So the more evidence we have of our own beginnings, that we evolved from the earth, that initially there were 5 or 6 types of human species, including Neanderthals and other cousins, and that they've been wiped out. And the more we understand about other animal species, that most of them have become extinct, and even in our own time, the number of extinctions that are taking place, the more we, of course, look at ourselves and say, well, actually, since we have no guarantee of some God saying you will survive and you're meant to come into, there'll be a second coming and you're going to all go to be judged at the end of the world, there's some guarantee of your existence, in some sense, going forward, then until that point of judgment comes, at least, then in this aloneness of the human species, we've realised actually we're just another species, and therefore we can become extinct. There's nothing, as Jung says, biology has nothing to say against this. In fact, it is common for species to go extinct. Keynes, who we've looked at, the necessity of government intervention, that the human prospects under capitalism in the 1930s at the time of crash could be benefited enormously by reforms. He showed technical means by which these reforms could take place. Manipulation of aggregate demand, for example, manipulation of monetary policy, manipulation of interest rates, all became technically far more understood. Liberal democracy, reason can alter the human condition, profoundly believed Keynes, because he was a liberal Democrat. And liberal Democrats of those days, of the liberal tradition and the intelligentsia of Britain, really believed that reason could make a massive difference, enlightened reason, and adjusted for reform, democracy is the ideal prospect for humanity, but it had to be adjusted with considerable state intervention. Sorokin we looked at briefly, and he had a rather large vision in which capitalism is a sensate culture, but he saw many signs in the mid-20th century of its deterioration of the sensate culture as it began to lose its path, particularly in the world wars and depressions that were typical of the period of the 30s and 40s, which he lived through as a middle-aged man. Remember, he was in the Russian Revolution. He was the secretary of Kerensky in the provisional government. The ideational cultures, which are spiritualized cultures, often follow sensate cultures. And so he gave lots of evidence in history of this, like the church and the Christian church following the Roman Empire, a ideational or spiritual culture following Roman sensate culture, materialistic orientation. So that might happen in our own period ahead, he suggested, that ideational cultures which have very different values to capitalism might emerge. Changing consciousness in the 20th and 21st centuries. Okay, there's been a lot of changes in consciousness. There's been discovery of the unconscious, the end of traditional repression. We now live as a totally different human being. It's not fashionable to be repressed any longer, is it? To be sexually repressed or to be repressed with your emotions. You're supposed to be far more expressive, and our instincts are good, aren't they? And we're not supposed to be as controlled as we were, and as buttoned up and as tight and well dressed and conformist and so on. And we're allowed to be freer. We're allowed to be ourselves. We're encouraged to try and find ourselves wherever it is. It's not given on a plate anymore. It's a lot more difficult to find. And in some ways we've said that's a rootless condition. In some ways it's an exciting condition. I personally prefer it to discover my own self rather than have it given to me on a plate by a church or an organisation or a class structure. So in some ways I'm for the experiment, certainly, rather than going back to tradition. But there's been enormous changes, science and medicine, the alternative societies of the 60s and 70s. How daring it was to smoke marijuana in the 60s. What a thing. Marijuana is being legalized in America now. It's actually on the verge of legalization. There's huge investments by the tobacco industries in preparation for the marijuana revolution that's about to come. The incorporation of the developing world. Vast parts of the world have now been incorporated. China and India, most of the world's population, have been incorporated into the capitalist system. These are massive changes in our consciousness. Workers' power was gained in the mid-20th century. Whereas capitalism had a solid run in the 19th century and was dominant, we suddenly had workers' power in Russia, workers' power in China. That was a major consciousness change. The prospects for humanity were being altered, weren't they? Female at our own time, the end of religion, and lots of other features of changing consciousness throughout our system. But I ask the question, has it fundamentally changed the human project? Has it fundamentally changed it at all? We've done lots of superficial changes, and there's lots of hope placed on various parts, like my father's generation, but terrific hope in the workers' revolution. Well, look where that got. People today put terrific hope in female equality. Let's see where that gets.
Do you mean I'll be happier now?
Will we be happier? Will it work even? You know, and so there's lots of experiments going on in our consciousness, aren't there? And lots of experiments in our sexuality, in our lifestyles, in our identities. But are we fundamentally changing the human prospect? Are we still faced with the same end of the railway track vision ahead? Heilbronner was the first to point to this end of the railway track, end of the journey, and say, look, it's been a wonderful journey so far. Capitalism has produced lots and lots of different things, and it's not just economic wealth, it's science and it's medicine and it's freedom and it's some amazing things that it's produced, as well as its destructive power. But he says at the end of the line, we're still faced with population explosion, as Malthus had predicted. We're still faced with the dangers of economic growth, which is the central raison d'etre of our system, producing a deadline ahead, seemingly as far more serious than ever envisaged before in terms of, for example, climate change, degradation of the Earth system, ecological disaster, and of course, immense nuclear danger from warfares and our new technologies. Lovelock, writing still alive and writing over the last 30 years, has given a host of predictions. For example, by 2020, extreme weather will be the norm, causing global devastation. By 2040, much of Europe will be Saharan. Parts of London will be underwater. The IPCC's, the International Panel on Climate Change, the most authoritative body on climate change, actually is quite close to its calculations on these things. Global warming is irreversible. Nothing can prevent large parts of the planet becoming too hot to inhabit or sinking underwater, resulting in mass migrations, famines and epidemics. It's only in recent history that we're in the interglacial period. Do you know that? We've had glacial periods for the last 100,000 years, and we've had interglacial periods in which the ice has somewhat melted. It hasn't melted entirely. We've expanded in this little interglacial period. You see? And if we'd left it alone, we'd probably go back to a more severe cold period, again, a bit of an ice age, and there'd be more dropping of water levels as water gets locked up in the poles. But of course, with these huge rises, we're not just talking about a couple of inches by 2050, you know, the effects could be extreme. And certainly recent Earth history shows that they can be extreme, except that we are now influencing the climate. But far from being interglacial, we're actually heating up the Earth. And it's been suggested that we actually stop calling this general period the Holocene. We call it the Anthropocene, which is the period of Earth history which has been most affected by the human species rather than natural forces.